Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and welcome to yet another not a PCB breakdown. This is not a PCB breakdown, no. Today we're going to be taking a look at sort of the theoretical side of how I'm going to be converting the GTR, how I'm going to be converting the RX 480 GTR VRM into an e-power. So, XFX gave me an RX 480 in exchange for content. And I did want to do some, I did want to get really nice, high scores on the card, but, I gave the card way too much memory controller voltage, and that killed the memory controller. So since that's no longer happening, I felt, well, the card is mine, and I don't really want to just hang it up as a wall ornament. The VRM on this thing is far too nice to just throw away like that, considering that this is a 6-phase using an IR3567B, 6894 low-side MOSFETs and 6811 high-side MOSFETs. These are direct FETs from International Rectifier. This is basically the same VRM that you would see on a reference Fury X, except this one actually is even, this one is physically larger. It takes up some more space, so it actually has lower thermal density, so theoretically, this VRM could handle a bit more power just because it's easier to cool this one. On a theoretical level, it also depends on some other things, but basically, the VRM here on the GTR is really, really awesome. So it doesn't make sense to just leave it hanging on a wall. I want to keep using this VRM, so I decided to convert it into a power board. So today we're going to go over sort of the plan behind that to give you some idea of what kinds of things go into making a power board out of a VRM. Now, one thing to note about the GTR and a lot of the RX 480s, because the other power board that I have fully operational is an RX 480. I also have an HD 7870 power board, which doesn't have voltage control, but it turns on, so that counts as working in my book. So the thing about power boards with these kinds of cards is that they're made a lot simpler thanks to this right here. This makes everything so much easier because that gives you I will get to it. But before we get to that, well, actually, no, we can get to it right now. So the thing about power boards is basically what you're trying to do is separate the VRM right here from everything else on the card, right? We don't need the rest of the card. And in fact, the GPU core right here is a massive pain to deal with. Basically, you cannot turn on this VRM as long as this is right here, because the moment you turn this on, this turns into a giant heater and fire if there's no heatsink on it. So you can't exactly, mess around with hot wiring the VRM while there's no heatsink on the GPU core. So we have to get rid of this part right here. And the way to do that on the GTR and a bunch of the reference RX 480s is really, really easy. You pop this memory chip off. If you have a BGA, if you have a hot air station, then you can desolder it and, do it all properly. But I don't have that, and even if I had that, I don't think I have the patience to do it the right way. So basically, the easy way to get this memory chip out of the way is to stick a box cutter under it or a flathead screwdriver. Stick that right under the chip and tap it in. Basically, you just force that in with, say, a hammer, gently. It really doesn't take a lot of force. You put any kind of wedge under a memory chip, tap it a bit, memory chip flies right off. Boom, gone. So memory chip is now out of the way. Now we take a hacksaw. Well, in my case, I take a hacksaw, but you could use a Dremel, any other kind of thing. Cutting PCBs is a terrible idea because they're made of fiberglass. So, take the necessary precautions for breathing, like filters and all that. You don't want to be breathing PCB dust. It sucks. So when it comes to cutting that, take those kinds of precautions. And then you're just going to cut the card right across here. Bam. And I did that with a hacksaw. So yeah, and, it really isn't hard. You don't need a Dremel. You can literally do it with a hacksaw. And the reason I cut it right there is because the voltage controller is right here. And some of the traces sort of seem to go into that sort of area, but this also gives me a really convenient ground right there and another convenient ground right there. If you really wanted to make this more compact, you could probably cut like that, sort of. So you would do like 2 cuts, but that's just like more work, in my opinion, unnecessarily, so don't bother. You can cut right here. It's, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but this is the easy way to cut it, and that's the way I've done it. That's how I did my reference RX 480. That's how I did the GTR. The GTR is already chopped up. I'm not going to be showing you the process for that. Sorry about that. Not going to be showing you the process, you know, for cutting the card. It's really not rocket science. You take a saw, you cut the card. Easy. So, at this point, the GPU core and the memory, well, this memory chip is still here, but this one isn't powered by this VRM, so we don't have to worry about it. If it was powered by this VRM, then, you know, same method as this one, we can just pop it off. So once we have this cut, we can actually start hotwire, like, trying to get the VRM to turn on. And this is really, really easy. So the reason why it's so easy is this has the PCIe slot connector right here. So normally the motherboard supplies plus 3.3 volts and plus 12 through the PCIe connector right here. And just go to Wikipedia or Google it, and then it'll throw you to Wikipedia. There is a diagram of how the 3.3 and the 12 volt pins on this are. And basically what you're going to do what I like to do is I take a SATA connector, because a SATA extension cable, which SATA power, not a SATA data. You want SATA power. So you take a SATA power, and those provide 12 volts, 3.3 volts, 5 volts, ground, basically everything you need. So they provide these 4 voltages. So we're going to take 12 volts and 3.3 volts from our SATA power connector. Bam, bam. GND, which I for some reason wrote as GNG. We're going to take GND and we're just going to hook up that to like a screw hole. Or, you know, like these pins are also ground. It's just, why would you bother with those when you have screw holes? Which, in my opinion, are much, much easier to solder onto. Well, they're not easier to solder onto. They actually take more heat to do, but they're better. Better ground. Also, any capacitor has a ground. Like, ground on a GPU is shared. Like, that, the ground plane is universal. Anything, like, basically everything is... Every ground on the GPU is shared by it's ground. Everything shares it. The only important thing to note is some grounds won't necessarily be very well hooked up to other grounds, because for grounding purposes, you really don't need a, massive layer of copper. Whereas for, like, say, the VRM needs to push a ton of current to the GPU core and then back, right? So the return plane, which is technically ground, going from the VRM to the GPU core, that one is a really big, heavy ground plane. Your screw holes around the rest of the card won't necessarily be as well connected. So basically, it's best to try grab your ground from whatever it is you're trying to power. So, like, if you're trying to provide, like, a good source, a good ground would be like 12 volts, these 12 volt capacitors, and really, it just doesn't hurt to add multiple different ground points if you want to. But just for getting it to fire up, screw hole is easy enough. So, really, the SATA connector can't actually push that much power. So, with this, you can just pull the ground to whatever. Screw holes are easy to find and convenient, so I'd put it on a screw hole. At this point, you can try fire the VRM up. Yeah, seriously. At this point, you can already try to fire the VRM up. It probably won't. The reason for that is this pin right here, pin 21 on the... This pin right here, the pin 21 on the IR3567B, that's this chip right here, and note that dot. That's that dot. So if we actually go, we can bisect the chip like that. This inscription is in the same orientation as that inscription, and this pin right here is the EN pin. That stands for enable. Normally, what happens is the GPU core goes and pulls the EN pin high. And then the VRM turns on. Except we just cut the GPU core right off. So that's not going to happen when we apply 3.3 volts and 12 volts to the to the PCIe slot. This is not going to fire up. So we need to pull the EN pin high manually, and the way to do that is basically figure out which of those pins is EN, which, let's see, that's 15, 16, 17, yeah, it's 21, and NC stands for no connect, but that's going to be that one. So that's 15. Man, this photo is not perfect for this, but we can make do. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. This right here is our pin. That's our target. Now, there are some people out there who have soldering skills good enough to solder directly onto that pin. I'm not one of those people, so I'm not going to bother. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stab this with a multimeter, and I'm going to trace it out to this area. Because if I'm... yeah, on the RX 480, one of the SMDs sort of in this area hooks up to that pin. Basically, you'll know that because there'll be a 0 ohm connection from one of these points, and I think it might be this one, or that. Well, actually, I have no idea. It might be that one. That one looks like it would be convenient. So, one of these points will be 0 ohms to that pin. So you're going to solder onto that point, and then you're going to pull a wire. You're going to run a wire all the way to 3.3, and you're going to have a resistor, and that should be like a 10K or a 5K ohm, or you want something high because we're just trying to pull the pin up, right? We're just doing logic. We're not actually pushing power through there, so it doesn't make sense. Like, yeah, you could technically just have a wire straight to 3.3 volts. The problem is that's not, that's not particularly great. It's better to do it through a resistor, as it will enable the voltage controller. Now, at this point, it still won't fire up the VRM. You still will have, if you measure the voltage across these 2 points, which these are the output capacitors for the VRM, if you measure the voltage there, you'll still be getting 0 volts, even though you've just pulled the enable pin high. And the reason for that is because while there is PWM signals coming out of the PWM pins of the IR3567B, the PWM signals, which side? They're sort of coming out of this side. Those go, and they go into here. Well, actually, I don't know which pin. They go into these, and these then turn the phases on. These chips control the actual MOSFETs. They turn them on and off. These are our driver ICs, and these are CHL85. Sorry, I'm writing with the mouse because So these are CHL8510s, also known as IR 3537s off the top of my head. But basically, these are driver ICs. And unfortunately for us, the power supply for the gate drive of the RX 480 GTR is not located on this side of the PCB that we still have, right? Remember, we cut the card. So the gate drive supply, which if I'm not mistaken is somewhere over that way. On the reference RX 480, it is somewhere over that way. On the GTR, it's probably also somewhere over that way because I can't find any circuit on this side of the card which looks like gate drive. So what you end up with is PWM signal is going into your CHL8510s, but the CHL8510s aren't turning on your MOSFETs. They can't turn them on and off. And the reason for that is that you have this right here. So you have HVCC. So this is the actual 3537. Now, on some other cards, you'll actually run into the issue that the actual the driver IC itself is not turned on. So you'll have a PWM signal going into the driver IC, and the driver IC isn't turned on. On the RX 480, what you'll run into is the driver IC is running. It's just not getting gate drive. So the reason why they will be running is because we did just apply 12 volts to the PCIe slot, which, conveniently for us, is VCC on the CHL 3537. This VCC pin, if we go into the documentation, connect this pin to 12 volt bias supply. So basically this hooks straight to 12 volts. And that's great. So basically these turn on, which is really, really convenient. A lot of other drivers out there, like, actually, I'll pull one up. Oops. Data sheets, drivers. Let's see, this should be a 5 volt. Yeah, VCC range of 4.5 to 5 volts. So like this one right here, you'd actually have a problem because this wouldn't turn on its own. You'd actually have to supply the VCC pin, which would be this one, pin 4. But we're not dealing with this voltage controller. Driver. We're dealing with the 3537, and the 3537 very conveniently runs off of 12 volts, so we don't have to deal with that. Lovely. Awesome. However, it's still not turning on our phases, and the reason for that is LVCC, LVCC and HVCC are, if you sort of, yeah, actually, HVCC, no, I'm not going to try to explain that. Basically, HVCC and, actually, it should say that right here, shouldn't it? Connect this pin to VCC 12 volts or a separate supply between 4.5 volts and 13.2 volts to provide a lower gate drive voltage on the high side MOSFET. Yeah, so basically, connect this pin, gate drive voltage for the high side MOSFET, the drive voltage on the low side MOSFET, place a high quality low ESR ceramic capacitor from this pin to ground. This pin must always be above, less than or equal to VCC plus 0.7 VDC. Right. So you can't actually put this above, if this pin, if LVCC or HVCC are significantly higher than VCC, things go bad. They probably won't work. If, depending, like, does it describe how it fails? It doesn't matter. Don't do that. It says so in the data sheet. So don't worry why. But yeah, basically, RX 480s don't do the whole connect this pin to VCC thing. Connect this pin to VCC. Instead, there is a gate drive circuit, which would normally be on the other end of the card, and that then provides the voltage. So what you have to do is provide power to... Why is this black now? Where did that go? Got confused. So, let me scroll up. Yeah. So, HVCC is this pin, LVCC is that pin, and these two on the RX 480 GTR and the RX 480 regular are combined. They're hooked up together. They're literally, every single one of these is just bam bam, like that. But the VCC pin is going straight to 12 volts, and this goes to gate drive, which we chopped off. So we cut that off, so we need to replace that. We could replace that with the 5 volts from our SATA connector. We could also just go and put a blob of solder between the VCC pin and the LVCC pin and do that on every single one of these just in case. And that would also solve all of your power issues. Lovely, isn't it? And that at that point, basically, you're driving your MOSFETs with 12 volts. Now, the reason why you might not want to drive your MOSFETs with 12 volts is, like, this is by far the easiest way to solve this, right? Well, actually, I'd argue the 5 volt way is better, but you'll see why when I do the practical, when I actually build the damn thing. But if you put 12 volts as your gate drive voltage, what you end up doing is you use a lot more energy just to turn the MOSFETs on and off. It does have some benefits. You get lower RDS on and the MOSFETs turn on faster, and they turn off faster. So you sort of get better MOSFET performance at the cost of this chip right here running a lot hotter. This doesn't actually matter. Like, basically, it's really bad for power efficiency of the VRM. right? You just send VRM power efficiency down the drain doing that. On the other hand, if you're running really, really high amounts of current through the VRM, it's great because your MOSFETs are running at pretty much peak operating capabilities. Using 12 volts to drive MOSFETs, especially something like the 6894 or the 6811 that the GTR uses, gives you a massive performance boost. Gives the VRM quite a kick in the performance department because these MOSFETs can actually take that much voltage. I think the 6894 and the 6811 I think are rated up to 15 volts. Some other MOSFETs are rated up to like 30 gate drive. Now the problem is you also wear the MOSFETs out kind of faster because this is basically the same as like over voltage on a CPU. You're using a higher voltage to turn the MOSFETs on and off, which makes them which means that they turn on and off faster, but you know, it has its consequences. And you lose efficiency on the drivers, but you know, 12 volts is the easy way. 5 volts is the 5 volts will get you better efficiency under low load. So if you don't have a ton of current going through the VRM, using 5 volts to drive the MOSFETs, better efficiency because you're losing less power on the drivers, and you don't really need a ton of voltage to get the MOSFETs. Like low current, low power loss through the MOSFETs. So your drivers dictate your power efficiency. Whereas if you're doing very high power use, then sure, go ahead and hook up 12 volts. However, I've never actually seen any power MOSFETs that can't take 12 volts gate drive. I imagine they exist, and if you hooked up those to straight 12 volts, they would die instantly. So, you know, that's another issue. For the GTR, I'm kind of considering experimenting with giving myself the option to use both 12 volts and 5 volts by using like a switch, by just using a switch. To basically configure the card between 5 volt, to configure the VRM between 5 volt and 12 volt operation. And, you know, you can also hook that up on the other side of the card. But yeah, basically after you hook up whatever voltage you want to actually drive the card with, 5 volts or 12 volts, really depend. Like, for power card operation, I'm going to go ahead and say that 12 volts is just better, because you do get better MOSFET performance. In most motherboards and graphics cards, you'll see everything driven with 5 volts because it gets you better efficiency at, like, idle. You get better idle efficiency. Well, actually, no. Generally, they sort of take a compromise route where they run 7 volts, which is why there is a separate gate drive circuit. Though do keep in mind that the PCIe slot does not have 5 volt pins at all. So a lot of cards have their own little 5 volt VRMs on them to generate that voltage. So, yeah. Hook up gate drive. You know, hook up gate drive from the SATA connector. Basically, you can entirely get this VRM running off of one SATA connector. At that point, you still can't use it to do anything because the SATA power connector has one 12-volt line, and it's really not designed, like the connector itself is not designed to handle high current. So if you said, you know, like, say you have your RX 480 GTR VRM, which is perfectly capable of powering something like, say, I don't know, GTX 570. That's probably what I'll end up hooking this up to first. Perfectly capable of powering a GTX 570. The problem is, if you only have the SATA power connector, it will melt the SATA power connector, which will suck. The VRM will be fine, though. So basically, after you get all of your stuff working off of the SATA power connector, you'll want to also hook up like a 6-pin, maybe 2 6-pins. If you have a really big VRM, you might even consider hooking up 3 6-pins. So, yeah. And then for voltage control, you'll actually have to deal with, where's the pin? Where is it? Oh, this one. Pin 6 right here. You'll have to pull this, basically, the way I have this on my RX 480 VRM is there's a potentiometer, which I do believe the circuit diagram for those is this. Ta-da! I'm so good at drawing! I can't fix that. If I press CTRL-Z, it's going to disappear. And this goes to VCore, so output. So VCore being Like, say the output of this capacitor, well, that's ground, but this is V-core. So it goes to that, and then the other end goes to GND. And basically, I can tell the voltage controller by default will aim for like 0.9 volts. That's the typical startup voltage for an RX 480 VRM, I think. That should be, no, that's like the typical startup voltage for AMD GPUs. So, doesn't really matter. Like, the problem is, basically after you cut the PCB, it breaks the original VSense circuit. And when that breaks, the card, when it initially fires up, will typically fire up to around 1.1 volts, which is 200 millivolts above that 0.9 figure. Though it's also completely possible that RX 480s boot on 1.1. I need to actually have a working RX 480 and probe it while it's turning on, but yeah. That's not going to happen because all of them are dead and all of them are, at this point, cut into pieces, so can't do that. But yeah, basically I have the potentiometer hooked up to GND and V-core. And then, you know, you can adjust this up and down, and that messes with what voltage the actual voltage controller sees, and so it compensates on the VRM, and it, you know, it's your good old-fashioned feedback voltage mod. So yeah, that's what I plan to do for the RX 480 GTR power card, because this VRM is really, really worth saving. And this time around, I really want to get everything like proper. Like, I'm actually super glad that I killed the first RX 480, because it's like, yes, I have a practice VRM. And then on the GTR, it's like I'm super excited to get this hooked up. Unfortunately, that won't be happening for a while, because there's also the GTX 1070 and all that, and it's like, if I could just like record both and post them on the same day, but so yeah, that's that for this video. In summary, cut the card, pull the enable pin high, cut the card, supply 12 volts, supply 3.3 volts, pull the enable pin high, check that you have VCC, so power for your drivers, check that the drivers also have gate drive power, those are typically separate, and if all of those are there, and the VRM should fire up. If they're not all there, then it won't work. There was not really much else to it. You might run into some obscure issues with other VRMs, but at least for the GTR, at least on RX 480s, it really is just a case of doing this, especially on the ones like the GTR, which have the VRM in this position and this layout. So basically, this is applicable to the reference RX 480, the GTR, the Red Devil from Power Color should be the same deal. There's a few other cards that are, again, like exactly the same as this. So yeah, that's that for this video. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below with any questions or concerns, or, well, concerns. Of course you're concerned. I'm going to be, well, I've already hacked up a few cards. But anyway, leave any comments, questions down below. I think I've gone through the like, share, subscribe thing already. I'm sorry, I'm kind of sleep deprived right now. But do all of that. And I also have a Patreon and a PayPal, and there's AHOC shirts. You can find them all down in the description below if you would like to support what I do here at Actually Hardcore Overclocking. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.